This video covers sections 2 through 6 of the Intro to Being and Nothingness, and it will consider 4 questions. 1. How does Sartre depart from Heidegger and Husserl on the question of being and consciousness? 2. What are the 3 characteristics of consciousness? 3. Is the being of phenomena distinct from the being of consciousness? And 4. In what ways are the features of being in itself distinct from being for itself? If you like this content and find it helpful, please consider supporting it by liking, sharing, and subscribing. In the last video, we examined Sartre's argument that phenomenology resolves the dualism of being and appearance, indicating that appearance has its own being. But what does it mean for an appearance to have being? Phenomena don't have being in the same way trees have leaves. Existence is not an attribute or quality of an object, yet existence reveals something of itself. It presents a particular kind of phenomenon, a phenomenon of being. This distinctiveness is evidenced by the fact that we enter certain moods in relation to existence, such as boredom or nausea. However, the question now is, if appearance has its own being, and being has its own distinct phenomenality, what then is the relationship between the phenomenon of being and the being of phenomena? It may be useful to note that this distinction Sartre is making is very close to Heidegger's one between the ontic and the ontological. Briefly, and a bit oversimplistically, the ontic concerns individual entities and closely aligns with Sartre's notion of the being of the phenomenon. On the other hand, the ontological refers to the concept of being as a whole, which aligns with Sartre's notion of a phenomenon of being. Heidegger asserts that although a crucial distinction persists between the ontic and the ontological, they are interrelated in the way that the ontological reveals itself through the ontical. At the same time, the ontical is authentically understood only in light of the ontological. Here, Sartre is in contention with Heidegger's philosophy. According to Sartre, the being of the phenomenon, the ontical, does not have or participate in being. It simply is being in its actual appearing. There is no other being behind the being of the phenomenon. And revisiting Sartre's suggestion from the prior video, phenomenology does away with the dualisms of potency and act. If we extend this to Heidegger's thought, then we could say, following Sartre's line of thinking, that we must rid ourselves of the distinction between ontological possibility and ontical actuality when it concerns the being of phenomena. Sartre appears to propose that the actuality of the phenomenon does not emerge from some prior potentiality, but instead, actuality generates its own possibilities. This formulation would be Sartre's distinct interpretation of Heidegger's formulation that existence precedes essence, as opposed to the classic formulation that would have existence arise out of the essence of a thing. Despite this disagreement with Heidegger, Sartre still upholds a distinction between the ontic and the ontological. However, rather than the ontological being something added to or preceding or lying in the background of the ontic, the ontological is its own distinct kind of being, and when it appears, though never fully appearing, this is the phenomenon of being. Thus we have 2 distinct kinds or classes of being, and Sartre both maintains something of Heidegger's ontic-ontological distinction while seemingly also radicalizing the difference. Later on in section 6, Sartre elaborates on this phenomenon of being, which he states is the meaning of the being of the existent, insofar as it reveals itself to consciousness, and adds that meaning has its own being based upon which it manifests itself. Sartre then asks, why not simply rid ourselves of this complication regarding the relationship between appearance and being by simply equating them? After all, is not the determinative factor of the being of the phenomenon its very appearing? For Sartre, this would simply amount to a renewal of Berkeley's famous epistemological dictum that to be is to be perceived. This subjective idealism is even something Sartre accuses Husserl's thought of being guilty of, especially to the degree that Husserl renders the noema as unreal. The noema is the intended object as it gives itself in its distinct characteristics. To elaborate on Husserl's thought further, correlations of the noetic and the noematic, and the intentional and intuitional are all but aspects of my consciousness. So in a certain sense, the being of the phenomenon lies in the being of an intending consciousness. And so just as Sartre seemingly radicalizes the difference between the ontic and the ontological in his formulation of the being of the phenomenon and the phenomenon of being, a la Heidegger, he now establishes a radical distinction between the being of the perceiving consciousness and the being of the perceived object, a la Husserl. He cannot allow for the all-encompassing nature of consciousness that he attributes to Husserl. Consciousness must encounter an otherness for it to be itself, and not merely an otherness as a modification of my own sphere of consciousness, the alter ego, but a genuine otherness with its own being distinct from the being of consciousness. The next two sections that follow will seek to establish this difference of beings. One problem of making knowledge the measure of being, or perception the measure of perceiving, is that it is an incoherent position. How so? To know an object requires a knower. The knower grounds the being of the object in knowledge. But what is this knower and what grounds it? Remaining consistent with an idealist epistemology, the knower must be another piece of knowledge born of an appearance. Yet everywhere I look, the knowing consciousness never appears except as itself an object, a known knowing consciousness, and never as directly the knowing consciousness itself. And even if we were to assert that the known knowing consciousness is one and the same with knowing consciousness, the knowledge itself must be grounded. And what is it going to be grounded in? Well, the knower of the known knowing consciousness, and so on and so forth. So we can see here that we run into an infinite regress. In light of such a realization, Sartre finds that we have to appeal to something beyond all knowledge and perception, something he calls trans-phenomenal. In section 3, Sartre develops what he calls the trans-phenomenal being of consciousness. This consciousness precedes knowledge and appearances, and yet is the condition of possibility for them. He identifies three characteristics of this consciousness in particular. First, it's a positional consciousness. This means that consciousness is always relating to something, a consciousness of, that transcends itself to reach an object. This is otherwise known by the concept of intentionality. Second, it is a pre-reflective consciousness. This feature avoids the infinite regress Sartre identified in the idealist epistemology. To be a pre-reflective consciousness entails an immediate awareness without it being a kind of knowledge. It is not an object, but a pure directed awareness of something other than itself. Consciousness is thus a kind of pure activity and a kind of pure relationality. Yet the being of those objects it acts upon and relates to are not one and the same with the being of consciousness. And this leads us to our third characteristic. Consciousness is an autonomous, non-substantial absolute. So let's break that down. It's autonomous in that consciousness exists from itself and is beyond all relation. Now, of course, we already indicated just before that consciousness is a relating of itself to something else, but consciousness does not depend upon what it relates to in order to be itself. It is the activity of relating itself. And so consciousness is always there as itself, not reducible to any prior cause, material, or otherwise. And this is what it means to be non-substantial. It's non-substantial in that it is a pure translucency without content or supporting substratum. Let's keep in mind that the term substance refers to the stuff a thing is made of, and that allows it to remain that thing despite alterations in its accidental or non-necessary properties. For Sartre, identifying the being of consciousness with non-substantiality is to paradoxically suggest that this being is at the same time a kind of nothingness, and we'll be developing that idea very shortly in following videos. Finally, consciousness is absolute, in the sense that it is not relative to any known object or situation. It's not relative to experience because it is the experience. Section 4 establishes that the being of the object perceived is not reducible to the being of consciousness. Here I'll be referring to individual objects as existents, since it is the term Sartre generally uses, and because there are some difficulties and philosophical assumptions often imputed into the terms object or thing, especially if we consider them in their Husserlian sense. Sartre disputes the idea that trans-phenomenal being is unique to the subject. Instead, the existent is not identical to the act of perceiving it. When perceiving a particular aspect of the existent, we apprehend its totality at the same time. What is apprehended in its totality, though, is not equal to what is directly perceived. There is some kind of distinction made between the existent as it appears to consciousness and our awareness or knowledge of it in its totality. A totality itself that is impossible to ever make an appearance. If there was no distinction between appearance and knowledge, then our knowledge of a table would simply be knowledge of consciousness itself, since there would be no independent being that we'd be talking about, since perceiving equals being. As such, the difference between appearance and knowledge directs us toward that which is beyond all appearance and exceeds our knowledge. Section 5, entitled Ontological Proof, is an attempt to establish the necessity of a being beyond perception. Of course, with such a title, Sartre is evoking the famous arguments for God's existence made by the likes of Anselm and later Descartes, whereas Anselm and Descartes argue for the necessary existence of God from the concept of God, God's essence. Sartre's argument is based on a relation rather than a concept. For there to be consciousness, there must be a being other than consciousness, because consciousness is itself only in being about something or relating to something other than itself, a revealing intuition. And this revealing intuition implies something revealed, something which must be present for consciousness to be present. And consciousness is only itself to the degree that it is not what is being revealed. As such, Sartre writes, consciousness is a being such that in its being is in question insofar as this being implies a being other than itself. Thus, the ontological proof for the being of existence lies in the existence of another being, consciousness. Stated another way, the fact that consciousness has its own being necessarily entails another being existing, for without that, there would be no consciousness. As such, Sartre has demonstrated not only that the perceived object of consciousness is not equal to the act of perceiving it, but has now shown how the being of the appearance has its own kind of being that is distinct from the being of consciousness. We find here then a twofold trans-phenomenality. 1, the being of consciousness, and 2, the being of the phenomenon. This work, Being and Nothingness, principally concerns these two beings, which we may more readily recognize as being for itself, referring to the being of consciousness, and being in itself, being connected to the being of phenomena. And so we can start to see how this introduction and its very detailed analysis of the question of being starts to tie into the rest of the book. The aim of this analysis in the introduction was to establish how being is not reducible to phenomenality. This allows us to get past some problematic aspects of idealism. And now, in positing two distinct beings, an ontological gap is discovered. A gap that is the condition of possibility for the radical freedom Sartre will lay claim to later on in this work. Section 6 concludes the introduction and leads to a preliminary consideration of the being of existence as being in itself and how this being contrasts with being for itself. He identifies 3 features of this being of existence. First, being is itself. It does not cause itself. It is neither passive nor active in itself. Human consciousness as being for itself is active, and it renders its objects passive for our use of them. Second, being is in itself. This means that it does not refer to itself or something other than itself. Instead, it is filled with itself, a full positivity or a synthesis of itself with itself. It can never be what it is not, and it knows no otherness or temporality. This would be in contrast to the being of consciousness, which is defined as what it is not rather than what it is. Being for itself is characterized by a transcendence that moves toward another being and toward otherness in general. Third, Sartre designates being in itself as a kind of too muchness or excess, de trop. Being in itself is its own reason for being. It is always aligned with itself. This is in contrast to being for itself, wherein we are marked by a fundamental misalignment. Whereas being in itself never has a relationship to itself, it simply is what it is. Being for itself is defined in terms of a certain self-relating and a disturbed self-relating at that. Along with liking, sharing, and subscribing, you can financially support this work using the Super Thanks button below this video. To be an ongoing supporter of this work, I have a Patreon page where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. I want to thank the following for already supporting this channel on Patreon. And this concludes the introduction of this work. As a reminder, we have only begun unpacking Sartre's argument, and so we'll have much more to say about the relationship between being in itself and being for itself than what has been so far offered. In the next video, we begin part 1 of Being in Nothingness, entitled The Problem of Nothingness. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.